Can Boris Johnson defy the odds and win the next general election for the Conservatives? I'm delighted to welcome to discuss this Conservative MP Barry Legg, former Conservative and UKIP MP Douglas Carswell, and editor of Conservative Home Mark Wallace. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Let me start, if I can, with you, Douglas. Do you think Boris is down but not out?
He's clearly down. I would be surprised, perhaps pleasantly surprised, if he led the Conservatives into the next general election. I'm not sure he would necessarily go immediately, but I would be surprised if he led them into the next election. And I think this goes well beyond who was at what party. I think the really significant thing is that, a year or two ago, most of Boris's core supporters would have given him the benefit of the doubt for reasons that are completely unrelated to what happened at what party in Downing Street. A certain number of core Boris Johnson supporters at the last election are no longer willing to support him. I think this has a lot to do with much of his administration behaving as though it's New Labour, as though it's Gordon Brown, as though it's Continuity Cameron. And I think that is what is ultimately going to count against him. Unless he can shift direction, cut taxes, rein back the state, unless he can be anti the political elite. It seems sometimes as though the political elite has actually triumphed under Boris Johnson. He was supposed to be an insurgent force, and he's ended up actually reinforcing the blob. Unless he can do something about that, then I suspect it's probably game over.
Barry Legg, you are the chairman of the Bruges Group, which celebrates the legacy and political philosophy of Margaret Thatcher, and you are a former Conservative MP. If you were in the Commons now, would you be submitting a letter to Sir Graham Brady at the 1922 committee calling for the Prime Minister's resignation?
Well, we may have come an awful way from Margaret Thatcher and Thatcherism and sound economic policies. But I think this would be the wrong time to try and get rid of Boris Johnson as leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. We're coming up to a crucial 4 months or so. Douglas has mentioned these local elections, and I think you have as well, which are going to be very important. And Boris has got quite a big intro to sort out in the next 4 months. In April, people are going to be faced with tax increases. His Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has raised national insurance contributions, and now somebody on $25,000 a year is going to be facing a marginal tax rate of 33%. That's far too high. And when people see their pay packets reduced in April, they're going to be very upset. So number one priority for Boris is to get those tax rates down and get them down in short order. Secondly, he's also got the problem of energy prices going up in April, which is going to be very, very tough for most people. Energy prices can be rising by as much as 50%. And they're going to find at the same time they've got a smaller pay packet, less take-home pay. So he's got to get those energy prices down. And those are the two issues that he should really be addressing, not trying to chase the crowd on whether it was a party or not a party. He's got to show real political leadership now. And if he does that, he's got a chance of getting through those local elections. Otherwise, it could be bye-bye Boris.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I think it was a diabolical misjudgment and an insult to the British people to have those parties. But I still see it ultimately as something of a soap opera. And I think that prime ministers should rise and fall based upon important issues that you've both mentioned, the economy and, of course, wider issues like the health service, the safety of our streets, national security and education. But Mark Wallace, you are the editor of the online Tory Bible, the news website Conservative Home. What's the word on the street about Boris?
Well, we've actually got a survey out at the moment with our panel of about 3,500 Conservative Party members asking them their views on his future, which we'll be publishing in the next couple of days, which will make for very interesting reading, I think. It's fair to say, without prejudging that, there's a huge amount of frustration. There's annoyance. Frankly, we're all used to the idea that in politics, people who don't happen to agree with you about one thing or another, or might be members of another party or tribe, will do their very best to find rocks to throw. The first responsibility you have as a politician is not to dig up a load of rocks and hand them to your opponents for them to enthusiastically sling right at you. And I think there is a lot of frustration that this is a self-inflicted problem with regard to the Prime Minister and the government more generally. It's not the first self-inflicted problem either, which adds to that kind of frustration. And particularly, it's not something that's come completely out of the blue. Fairness is one of the most fundamental motivating emotions for the British voter. The idea, exactly as Douglas said earlier, of there being an elite or an out-of-touch gaggle in Westminster who feel that it's one rule for you and one rule for me. And if you're particularly in the role of setting such stringent rules as we've seen during a pandemic, something that those restrictions that you mentioned earlier that applied so heartbreakingly to everyone from the Queen to the rest of us, you have to be whiter than white in that situation. I think Barry's absolutely right when he says there are these huge issues on cost of living, the huge questions about what this government's actually going to do with its majority. There are millions of young people crying out for homes to live in, etc. But this kind of row also affects the government's capacity to do that because it strikes at the Prime Minister's authority. And when the Prime Minister's spokesman today apparently wasn't willing to say whether this was the end of revelations about parties or not, when members of Parliament hear things like that, it doesn't exactly inspire them to stick their necks out for Downing Street.
Although, Mark Wallace, you will agree that just a cursory glance at Boris Johnson's CV will suggest that you underestimate this man at your peril.
Oh, yes. I mean, the fact is that he's got, people often say 9 lives. We're in the unusual situation with Boris that nobody knows quite how many lives he's got, and nobody's managed to really accurately keep a tally of how many he's used up so far. So, yeah, I think, as your panel were saying earlier, I think it's a rare occasion of me agreeing with Lembit Opik. The local elections are going to be extremely important in this process. I was chatting to an MP a couple of days ago who said, basically a lot of people in the Parliamentary Conservative Party are feeling pretty hacked off. They want to keep their heads down and see quite how bad a mullering they get come local election day. That, I should say, for a lot of our readers is a pretty annoying attitude because it means a lot of them getting Labour councillors and Lib Dem councillors, which they do not want.
Douglas, I'll come back to you in a moment. Barry Legg, is there a natural heir apparent to this role of Prime Minister that would satisfy the Thatcherite Bruges group?
I don't think there's any candidate waiting in the wings that has yet got sufficient credibility. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is responsible for these quite significant increases that we're going to have coming through in taxation. And they're going to cause very significant political problems. So I think he's not yet proven as someone of the calibre to be Prime Minister. There's been a lot of talk about Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary. Well, I don't think people know a lot about Liz, and she hasn't had to handle many real political problems. James Callaghan, who was Prime Minister for several years, he held the main offices of state. He was Chancellor, he was Home Secretary, he was Foreign Secretary, and he was Prime Minister. And he said that being Foreign Secretary was a bit of a dog. You didn't really have to do very much. You flew around the world and you met people. Those other big jobs were big jobs, dealing with serious political issues every day and having to formulate policy. So I think Liz is pretty much untested at the moment. And it will be interesting to see how she handles the Northern Ireland Protocol and her negotiations with the EU over that. That is a very, very significant problem and is a grave threat to the integrity of Northern Ireland. So people will be watching her carefully, and they'll see how she performs. And when we see some actions from Liz, we'll know whether she's capable of possibly holding the office of Prime Minister. So I think those are the two main runners at the moment. Michael Gove has had several tries in the past. He may try again. But I think he's held an awful lot of positions, and many of the unsatisfactory aspects of our withdrawal from the EU are probably to be laid at his door.
Is there anybody, Barry, is there anyone in the current Conservative Party that Margaret Thatcher would anoint as next leader? Who would get her vote, do you think?
Probably somebody like Jacob Rees-Mogg. I know Jacob's taken a lot of flack in recent days about his comments about the Conservative MPs in Scotland, but Jacob has actually got a very good grasp of economics and taxation. He's been a businessman. He's been a very successful businessman, and he's got very strong principles. So if we're talking about somebody that Margaret Thatcher might like, she might well like Jacob. But I think Jacob, he's got those strong points to him, but he's also needs to work on conveying himself as a person of determination and integrity and being close to the people. So
Rees-Mogg gets Thatcher's vote.
Mark, I think one of the fundamental strategic problems the Conservative Party faces is that for years now, it has selected people to be A-list candidates based on woke criteria rather than ability and character. And this means that you fundamentally weakened the parliamentary party. There's just not the talent pool that there may have once been. There are some talented people there, but there's an awful lot of dross. There are an awful lot of third-rate mediocrities. And that begins to show when you look around the cabinet table and you see a real shortage of talent. It is because of A-list woke candidate selection. And I'm afraid if the Conservative Party doesn't address this, if it continues to select people as New Labour, it will end up being like New Labour, detached from its roots, part of the establishment, and part of the problem, rather than a vehicle that insurgent voters can turn to for real change.
With Douglas, a Prime Minister in Boris Johnson that cannot say on national television that only women have a cervix. So I think the theme of this conversation and the theme of many emails that I get to this show are that Boris's greatest failing is that he's not a Conservative Prime Minister. Douglas.
Let's not be too harsh. There are some very good Conservative things that he's achieved. Brexit. I think the real disappointment, though, is that on many fronts, particularly when it comes to economic policy, energy policy, he has too often accepted the establishment thinking that he found on entering office in Whitehall, rather than changing it, rather than resetting the establishment agenda. He has, in many ways, carried on. We have a sort of continuity of Gordon Brown's tax policy. We have a continuity of Ed Miliband's energy policy. We have a continuity of David Cameron's failure to control our borders. And I think most tragic of all, having left the European Union, there's no clear vision as to what it is that we're in office, or rather he is in office, to try to seek to achieve. Now, COVID concealed this fundamental lack of strategy for a long time because it allowed us to talk about something other than the purpose of being in office. But I think as the epidemic abates, it's going to become blindingly obvious that we are faced with an administration that is in office but not in power, has ambition but little vision. There's a clique of courtiers in number 10 Downing Street who are not accountable to anyone, who are not accountable to MPs, who are not even accountable to cabinet ministers, who treat being in Downing Street as a bit of a wheeze, and who are they probably only meet ordinary members of the public when they go to the off-licence to buy more booze or pick up their dry cleaning. This is the fundamental root cause of the problem. And a party led by someone who led the Brexit campaign ought to understand this problem. I really do think it needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency, or I suspect the current incumbent may tragically be one of the shortest prime ministers since, I think, Bonner Law.
Well, yes, I mean, you, of course, are one of the architects of the Vote Leave Brexit campaign. If there was a Mount Rushmore for Brexit, your face would be chiselled into that mountain. Let me tell you, Douglas. Briefly,
it would be a molehill, I'm afraid. Never. Look,
obviously, we did get out. Brexit happened, and you contributed to that story. But very briefly, if you can, I'll ask each of you, starting with you, Douglas. I won't hold you to this, but who leads the Conservative Party into the next election? What's your best guess?
I simply don't know. And I think if there was a clear answer to that, we would see some change.
Okay. Mark Wallace?
Predicting this is an absolute mugs game. I would say watch out for an unexpected kind of push from 2017 or 2019 MPs.
Oh, good to know. Possibly some red wall action. And how about you, Barry Legg? Who leads the Tories into the next election?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question. It's very difficult to make an assessment for the reasons that Douglas has reiterated. And in my early remarks, I did refer to a number of potential candidates, but they really need to be put through their paces and show whether they are people that can deliver, are in tune with conservative philosophy, and can actually relate to the people and get votes.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. Former Conservative and UKIP MP, one of the key architects of Vote Leave, now an academic based in the United States, Douglas Carswell. The editor of the online Tory Bible, the news website Conservative Home, Mark Wallace, and former Conservative MP and now chairman of the Bruges Group, which celebrates the legacy and political philosophy of Margaret Thatcher, Barry Legg.